Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Spathrakis. I'm the manager of local government relations with BC Assessment. Today, we'll be talking about Property Assessment 101, specifically valuation classification and the direct relationship to taxation. A couple of the topics we'll cover, as I mentioned, in addition to valuation, are a little bit more detail about the relationship between assessment and taxation specifically to conclude the particular slides that we're going to see today. So firstly, a little bit about BC Assessment. So BC Assessment was established as a result of a nonpartisan commission examining property assessment and taxation in the province. In 1974, via the Assessment Authority Act, we were created to be a provincial crown corporation that operates independently of both the taxing function and politics, both at provincial and local level, to provide province-wide property assessment services for the basis of taxation. In 1975, there were approximately 879,000 properties assessed. Fast forward to today, there's over 2.1 million properties assessed in the province. In terms of our core product, it's our annual assessment roll, which lists the properties, ownership, value, classification, and exemption. Again, over 2 million properties for the 2021 assessment roll with a value of over $2 trillion. The importance of the assessments are that they generate a stable and predictable tax base for over $8 billion annually in property taxes for important local services and schools across the province. In terms of how we value properties is what we'll discuss next. In particular, the majority of properties, about 96% or so, are valued at market value. That will be the focus of this presentation today. Market value is essentially the price that a property would fetch in an open competitive market with all parties to the sale acting with good knowledge and not under any undue duress, for example, to buy or sell a property. So most properties, when I say that again, about 96% primarily are residential and commercial properties. There's a small number of properties that aren't valued at market value, making up about 4% of the assessment roll. And those are primarily things like independent power producing properties, major industrial properties, farms, managed forests, and properties that have a higher use potential but are used singularly for residential estate purposes. So these are all assessed essentially at non-market or regulated rates. So you might ask, why market value? Well, the International Association of Assessing Officers indicates that market value-based taxation ends up resulting in taxes that are uniform in terms of similar properties or similar valued properties end up paying a similar amount of tax. That also relates to it being fair when a property value is accepted as a proxy for wealth. The amount of taxes that are levied relate to ability to pay. It's transparent in terms of a consistent approach in that all properties are assessed in a similar manner, and it's easy to understand in terms of being based on comparable sales and income generating capability of properties. So the IAAO concludes in saying where sufficient property information and skilled valuators exist to maximize fairness and understanding in a property tax system, assessment should be based on current market value of a property. In terms of factors that affect market value of assessments, of course, the age-old real estate cliche of location, 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 it definitely affects property values in terms of proximity to amenities and transit, distance to work locations, for example. There's a few locational-based factors, also proximity to nuisances, things like garbage dumps or perhaps heavy agricultural areas where there might be noxious smells or things like that at play. Market values are also affected by land use controls, things like official community plans, zoning bylaws, and restrictive title covenants that may say prevent certain uses of a property from being made. Land characteristics in terms of physical land characteristics also affect market value, things like shape, slope, access to utilities for a property. They can affect how it can be used. Also building characteristics in terms of age, type, and quality of construction. The intended use of construction also can affect value. And lastly, income potential for a property in terms of rents, expenses, and vacancy, for example, can affect market value. The foundation of market value based on some of those factors that I just discussed is called highest and best use. You've probably heard the term mentioned before in the news, primarily as it relates to, say, redevelopment properties in urban areas. What is being talked about is the foundational aspect or principle of market valuation, which dictates that we have to consider as appraisers and assessors the reasonable probable use of a property that is physically possible in terms, again, there are no property characteristics that prevent certain types of uses for being developed on a property. For example, higher intensity uses need access to services, so those have to be available, or it will limit the use that can be made of the property. Once a property is considered, or uses of a property are considered to be physically possible, the next thing that an appraiser or an assessor must consider is which uses are legally permissible of the physically possible uses, that is. So, for example, what does the zoning bylaw allow? Is it just residential use, or does it allow a wide range of mixed uses on property? The potential uses affect what can be developed on the property and thereby the value. Next, of the physically possible and legally permitted uses, an appraiser must consider what is the maximally productive use of property in terms of which use would yield the highest return on investment for developing that property. Part of that ties into the last point about financially feasible. So of the physically possible, legally permitted uses, which would generate a positive return. Essentially, the one with the highest positive return is the maximally productive use. So when we're looking at a property, if it's vacant and it could be developed with anything from a single family dwelling, for example, all the way up to a mixed use, say condo and commercial tower, if the market determines that the highest return on investing for development is that mixed use tower, that is the highest best use of the property, and that's how the market would see the value of it being established. So how do we determine market value when we're considering highest best use? There are three generally accepted approaches to valuation. First being the cost approach, or that a person would pay no more for the cost of acquiring a property with the same utility as the property you're attempting to value. What that means is purchasing the land and building improvements that are of similar utility as the property you're attempting to value. The second approach is a direct comparison or sales approach, whereby a purchaser would pay no more for a property than the cost to acquire an existing property with the same utility in the market. And the difference again there is an existing property versus having to develop one. Lastly, there's the income approach to valuation, which converts the anticipated benefits of owning a property, namely the market rentable value, into from owning the property into a value estimate. So in the next slides here, I'm going to go over a couple of sample valuations to illustrate the factors that we just talked about, both the approaches to valuation and the characteristics and considerations for things that affect market value. I'll start with a sample residential property valuation. In this case, what you see is similar information to what our appraisal staff would be looking at when they're trying to determine the assessed value of a property. The property or subject on the left is the property that we're attempting to value, we could say, and the three properties to the right are all recent sales of similar properties in similar locations. So you can see there they each have a sales price and a sales date, and below that you can actually see the 2021 assessed values. You can get a sense of the relationship there between sale prices and assessed value. So the types of things, again, that our staff would be looking at are things like year built, the description or the type of house. For example, in this case, these are all one-story homes with basements. Specifically, they are what we would call a grade level entry main up basement house. We have information about the bedrooms and bathrooms. We'd be particularly focusing on the first floor area in this case and comparing the sizes, as well as the basement size and total amount of basement finish. Other aspects we would look at, for example, is that the one property, sale 2, has a suite, whereas the others don't. That can affect the market value of a property depending on the community and neighborhood that you're in. And we also look at things like parking. Is it a carport, a garage, or just a driveway parking? In terms of the land, you can see here that we're also looking at square footage. And at the very bottom, you can actually see distance from the subject property. So when we look at these properties, we can clearly say they basically sold in the range of about 571 to 580,000, and they're pretty much assessed all within the range of about 570 to $580,000. So pretty tight range of values, quite good sales. They're hovering around our July 1st valuation date, which I must stress is actually quite important that our assessments, remember, are based on market value at July 1st. So when assessment notices are received, like they were this recently, this January, they're based on July 1st, 2020 market value. So important to remember that. Now, in terms of these properties, I just thought it'd be interesting to show you the proximity. So this is clearly one subdivision, and what you can see is the subject property in the blue box, and the red boxes are the sold properties. So in this case, very good information for determining the assessed value of the property, and one of the sales even being right beside the subject we're trying to value. Now, I'll move on to a sample commercial property valuation. So here, you'll recall that I talked about income characteristics affecting the market value for properties that sell based on the amount of rental income that they generate in the marketplace. So here we have a 3-story mixed retail and office building. And what we've done here is break out the different types of space. We survey the market, so property owners and property managers and real estate information, to find out what market rentable value is for similar types of spaces in the marketplace. What that means is, in this case, if this space was vacant and available for rent, what is the typical asking rents or achieved rents in the marketplace right now? We would assign a rentable value per square foot. You can see the range from office to retail in this case. We would also go to the market and say, what is a typical amount of vacancy for similar type space in the market, in the area, based on the use? In this case, we've applied, for example, 5% for a portion of the retail, which is dictated to fast food outlet. We've also applied 7 and 7% both to the retail and the office space. The last thing that we have to consider in terms of the rental factors is, again, what is the typical type of expenses? Mainly in this case, we're looking at structural repairs and maintenance and management of the property that an owner would incur for running the property, renting it out, and generating the income. So once we factor in the rents and we take away for vacancy and expenses, you can see that the calculation generates a net operating income. So that's the net income that goes to the owner. That's anticipated, or that is the actual benefit they receive from owning the property and renting it out. But we factor that in to an estimate of value by looking at what income properties sell for in the market, where we know what the net operating income is, and we're able to derive a factor called a capitalization rate. The idea here being that we divide the income by the capitalization rate to generate a market value. So you can see the slide here, the calculation is present on the screen, kind of help illustrate how we would actually do it. So for the residential properties, what I showed you is a direct comparison approach. And for this commercial property, what I'm demonstrating here is the income approach. Again, it's those market factors that determine these valuations. So next, I'm briefly just going to touch on classification, because we not only do we value properties, we also classify them, and we classify them based on how they're physically used. So why we classify properties is to allow variable class taxation, for example, residential versus business tax. And as you can see here, we have 9 broad classes. I'm not going to get into them in great detail, but they range from residential to utilities and to supportive housing, major industrial, light industrial, business and other, managed forest, recreation and nonprofit, and farmland. And again, we classify properties to allow the variable taxation, as well as exemptions from taxation as an assessment that are based on particular uses of properties. Again, I'll briefly just touch on this topic of the exemptions just so that you understand that through the calculation, and I'll refer to that later on, that some properties receive a release from paying all or a portion of a tax levied by a local taxing authority due to an exemption from taxation. And there's two common types: statutory, which is automatically granted by legislation in pieces of legislation such as the Local Government Act or the Community Charter, or permissive exemptions, which are granted by taxing authorities by way of passing permissive exemption bylaws. So just keep that in mind when we get to the formula for determining property taxes payable later on. So now we'll move on to the part where now I've told you information about how we assess, classify, and potentially exempt properties. I'll bring that back together to the relationship between taxation. So not often does BC Assessment get written cartoons in the news about, but I just thought this was kind of an interesting one because I hope the information I've just shared will help bring a little clarity to the process of how we value and why market value, in particular to the formula that I'm about to show you. But I think what you'll see here is the formula is rather straightforward. And this goes back to the point that the IAAO mentioned about assessment by market value and taxation by market value being understandable. I've explained to you how we assess properties. Namely, I've showed you the example of a residential and income property. Well, it flows through to how properties are taxed based on their value. Again, based on how they're classified, which I mentioned, which is based on the physical use of a property and the tax rate assigned to that property class within a community. And then the end result, of course, is the property taxes payable for a given property. So starting with the value and the classification, less any exemptions, which I mentioned, times the tax rate for that property class equals taxes payable. So BC Assessment's focus is, of course, the assessed value, the classification, and application of exemptions where appropriate, whereas local government, of course, or taxing authorities focus on the setting of tax rates and determining the total amount of taxes to levy and collect. So one last thing before I close that I think is important to bring up, as it often comes up when the assessments are released annually, is that the impact of assessment on taxes payable down the road come tax time. It's important to remember that just because an assessment went up a certain amount doesn't mean that the property taxes payable are going to go up proportionately to that, and vice versa for a decrease. So as the graphic shows here, what's really important or critical is what is the average change for a given property class in a community. As the graphic shows, if your property increased less than the average change for the property class, let's say residential, then all things being considered and the taxing authority's budgetary requirements being maintained, taxes are likely to decrease. If you increase similar to the average for the class in the community, your taxes again are likely not going to change if budgetary requirements remain the same. Now, if you go up more than the average change for the class in the community, your taxes are likely to increase. And the same is said for the decreases. So if you go down less than the average, your taxes are likely to increase. If you go down more than the average, your taxes are likely to decrease. And if you change similar to the average, there's likely to be little change in your taxes. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'll just say that if anybody has any questions about assessment or taxation or particular issues you'd wish to discuss in your community, please feel free to reach out to me via localgovernment@bcassessment.ca or 1-866-VALUE-BC extension 00498. And I thank you for your time today.